The 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt does not talk about stuttering or disability at all, but she does talk a lot about speech in ways that I think are helpful for us in the dysfluency studies community to think about. So, Hannah Arendt draws this tension between two sides of speech that I want to think about in the context of dysfluency. Um, and this is the tension between what Arendt calls, on one side, the glory of speech, and on the other side, the suffering of speech. And I do hesitate to draw the connection with suffering and stuttering because there's a danger of misreading and misunderstanding and putting stereotypes about stuttering, but I think this is important to think about. So, on the one hand, we have the glory of speech. And here Arendt is thinking about the great speeches and the great acts and the great words that are said and remembered throughout history, right? So we can think of the speeches of Pericles, for example, or Napoleon, and these kinds of speeches, or George Washington, right? We can think about this great speech that that goes down in history in a kind of way, right? Arendt, in the more mundane sense, is also thinking about, say, a silver tongue, right? This great speech that is perfectly mastered and has rhetorical power, and we have a silver tongue that does what we want it to do. So this means both that we master our tongue, but also that mastering our speech allows us to accomplish what we want to do in the world with certainty. So to convince people with certainty, or to create a certain understanding in the world. And the goal of the glory of speech here is always a kind of heroic control, a mastery of ourselves, our speech, and then also, because of that, the mastery of other people, right? And while the logic of compulsory fluency would like us to think that this is the whole story about speech, Arendt does not stop here. The glory of speech only for Arendt makes sense if it's put together with the other side, and this is what she calls the suffering of speech. So for Arendt, for our words to have any meaning at all, they must be encountered by a common world that we can never control. To speak in that way is to give up control of our voice and to release it into a world of unpredictability, where the meaning that people make of our speech is not entirely up to us. It's not under our control entirely, right? So to quote Arendt on this topic, she says, because the actor moves among other beings, they are never merely a doer, but at the same time a sufferer. To do and to suffer are two sides of the same coin. In other words, in our context, meaning is always made together in really unexpected ways. This is what happens when people come together in an unpredictable world, when none of us are masters of the situation, but we're all involved in the unfolding of a moment, and we can even shift how this moment unfolds, right? So disabled voices highlight this tension between the glory and the suffering inherent to speech. What I don't mean here is that people who stutter suffer in the normal sense of the word more than others, and that they suffer in the sense that's used to justify the elimination of disability. What I instead mean is that there is an element of everyone's speech that Arendt calls suffering. The fact that because no one is master of themselves and others, our speech relies upon other people to have meaning and weight in the world. So to be honest about the suffering of speech, or to be honest in that regard about the suffering of fluency, means that we need to own up to the fact that there's an element of unpredictability to speech that humans can never outmaneuver. What our words can do or what they can't do is never dependent just upon ourselves and dependent upon the sheer will, but it's dependent upon the web of people and things that we find ourselves in. This means that we cannot get away with accidents from our communication. Instead, I think that the possibility of accidents, because our speech is exposed to the world in this fundamental kind of sense, the very possibility of accidents is what makes communication meaningful. And those who just try to be fluent and to master their speech to avoid accidents are actually avoiding something really central to being human.